First, I'd like to give greetings in the name of my ancestors, Alafia, Assalamu alaikum, rahmatullahi barakatuh. And we have to just, we just have to breathe. First, for a second, let's just breathe. Because this has been, I'm gonna do it. And exhale. My heart is full. I don't know how you feel, but perhaps your brain and heart are full in terms of this experience coming back after 3 years. So I just want to commend you all for being here, for staying the whole time, for engaging with your whole selves and sharing your love, your wisdom, your heart, your breath, yes, the spit as well. But that's all important in terms of all these things and coming back together again. I also like to thank our host. Stormy is full of much grace, and the Lord is very much with thee. Also to our other keynote speakers, Nadia Shaw, Wade Caves, Kira Sutherland, Lynn Bell, also for her wisdom, and even my Jotunheim sister, Kelly, standing in the wake of giants. I'd like to thank you. For real. So yay, we're back together again. Now what? What is going to happen? So what have we learned? So we're going to talk about a very interesting example, talking about the World Wide Web as a Saturn return. 2020, the year the fit hit the shan. The pain of getting canceled, a path forward calling in, lessons learned from building diversity, and some cautions. So I hope to do this all within, I think we can do it roughly under an hour. But I must warn you, and I'm going to say that there may be some uncomfortable truths I have to say to all of us, to our community, because it's been an interesting 2 years. Has it not been an interesting 2 years or 3 years? There's a lot of things that I've learned, a lot of things that I've had to process and rethink, things that I thought I knew at the start of this pandemic, and to see that things have gone in a different direction. So here is the chart for the worldwide public debut, the World Wide Web, for the public debut of the World Wide Web, August 6th, 1991, 4:56 p.m. in Geneva, Switzerland. What's interesting is just to see the chart, on top of it being a moon in Gemini. Isn't that fitting? It's like right there. And the time is supposedly accurate. It's a 9th house sun with Jupiter also up there. But we're paying close attention to that Saturn. So this was a return for that Saturn. And in thinking about the web's first Saturn return, because it's probably going to be with us for some while, is that I generally think of Saturn returns as times of accountability and owning one's sense of authority or authorship of one's life. I always say that this is a return on investment. The community has been investing in you. Your society has been investing in you. It's now time to have returns on that investment and have dividends of experience. And so what is powerful about the World Wide Web is I actually shudder to think how we would have endured this pandemic without the World Wide Web. Now, yes, we can talk about the disinformation that came with it, but also there was information, and then there was still the comfort on some level of each other in terms of people who came together. I've talked to a number of you during the conference, and there's some people who met during the pandemic. Many of you started studying astrology during the pandemic. And so there was an open source of information and wisdom and connection that I don't think we would have had if we didn't have each other through the World Wide Web. So we actually are seeing a very live example of the power of a Saturn return. So that's one particular thing that we can contemplate. And then there was 2020. When I say the fit hit the sand, and it kind of blew all over the place. And I just want to leave you with some of these images, and then I'll, well, not leave you, but show some of these images and have you contemplate them. And then I'll talk about them. Much of the world, especially the United States, was divided politically, and it was very hard to have any kind of civil discourse during that period. There was a global pandemic with deaths and illness. Many folks endured loneliness and separation from loved ones. You know, there's probably a story we each can tell about a loved one. I had an aunt who ultimately died alone because she couldn't be seen by her children or family. She didn't die from COVID, but it affected everyone, whether you had COVID or not. And then we had the death of George Floyd, or I should say the murder of George Floyd, and that motivated a lot of change, and a lot of discussion, and a lot of action. And then Zoom. Now, I've been on Zoom since at least 2014. I know Kira was talking about this too, since 2014, 2015. And it was always kind of like a hard thing for me to talk to clients, like, well, get on Zoom. I don't have that. Well, you know, it's not that hard. I don't know about that. And then suddenly, everyone is willing to get on Zoom, right? You know, it used to be like, well, do you have Skype? Well, I don't use Skype. But do you have, you know, something? But now Zoom became a platform, and it's not just Zoom. And we had GoToMeeting, GoToWebinar. We had the proliferation of different things. I mean, I attended weddings, funerals on Zoom. All kinds of things happened that couldn't happen in person. But the question is, how did it affect our community, the astrology community? We went from a few organizations having webinars and online events to nearly everybody having one. Online events and classes happened at lower costs, and that brought different kinds of people who normally wouldn't come to astrological events. So this is actually important to contemplate. This also meant an unfamiliarity for established astrologers with new technology and new audiences with differing tastes and opinions. And then I can say that it actually set afire a powder keg that had been nestling in the astrology community that was waiting to explode. And so we saw some of that, including some people getting canceled. Now, I'm gonna have an open discussion about that. But when I say open discussion, I'm probably gonna keep on talking. But there are a number of astrologers who was canceled. I was almost canceled. I don't know, some of you who know me on Twitter know that I was almost canceled on Twitter. And I can tell you briefly how that happened and then move on. But how that happened is that in my righteous zeal, right, I challenged a particular tarot reader and some, you know, student of astrology who was offering recorded readings and then just disappeared, and some people were asking about their money. And so I took it upon myself, you know, sometimes I wear that S for real. And I was like, what's going on, blah, blah, blah. And I bloviated all over the internet about that, or I should say on Twitter, and I was wrong. This person actually was going through some trauma, and for her own safety, she got off Twitter. And I didn't realize I was wrong because I had a throng of people coming at me. Some of you may know what I'm talking about, how it goes. You know, you have a storm of people coming after you saying like, what's wrong with you? I thought I could like you, blah, 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 you know. Like, I'm unfollowing you. Goodbye. Take care, right? But it took me a moment to realize I was wrong. And I'll talk about what one can do. But it wasn't just me, but it was a number of astrologers who experienced that sense of cancellation. So what does that mean? So let's talk a little bit about cancel culture, because I think it's important to have a context for it. It was first coined by Black Twitter users in 2015. I think that's important to note because, like, yeah, where's cancel culture and blah, 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 people talking about it, not realizing where it comes from. And it began as a means of calling out friends and acquaintances for microaggressions and other hateful remarks. One of the things that's interesting about, because I've been active on Twitter since 2009, one of the things to understand as a context, because a lot of people talk about cancel culture without recognizing this context, is that for many had ways of hiding behind institutional power for centuries without any kind of accountability. And social media, especially Twitter, became a way to level that playing field, to be able to call out people and to say, like, what are you doing? And so it wasn't just a matter of like, you know, sieging, you know, the bastions of Western civilization, as much as people who had been denied power historically, having some measure of power in calling out and challenging structures that have been antithetical to their very being. So I think it's important to recognize that. So largely social media became, it proliferated from 2009, and some would see it as a mob rather than thinking that it's also a way in which people who were seeking justice had means and avenues toward justice. And then there were other things and dimensions of cancel culture that had been in the work. I remember specifically taking some personal offense until I had some education about it, with people saying like, men are trash. And I was like, I'm not trash. And then there was always some defense, and there was all these memes about the Kool-Aid man breaking through, like, not all men, right? And recognizing that really it was dealing with centuries of frustration that many women had with the trash that men would do. And I had to recognize that rather than just being all in my feelings about hurt and not really taking stock of what was happening in terms of the larger discourse. So I'm sharing this with you to give you context, because I know some of you have had these feelings. I've talked with people and it's kind of like, well, what are they doing? Well, this is some measure of what's happening. So it was sometimes with the spirit of having accountability, but sometimes we also had accountability with disregard. And so a lot of these things also occurred in terms of confusion, banishment, all these particular feelings related to it, dealing with racism, indifference, name calling, petty victories, but victories, and not having therapeutic space. So it's important for us to assess the impact of cancel culture in the astrology community. Shutdowns happen with established astrologers and aspiring ones, leading to breakdowns. So a lot of people who in the astrological community who had been long established were called out, or because they said something. We didn't have pathways to really have reconciliation, the spirit of keeping energy together. And then I started to see that there was a growing sense of weariness between those who were new in the astrological community and some were old. And so what I mean by that, there were some astrologers who had been on Twitter or social media. It's like, you know what, bump this. They didn't say this. Okay, I'm paraphrasing. Bump this, I'm getting off. And then that actually was, for me, a very sad moment, recognizing that we weren't fostering a conversation together anymore. It became a divide between those who were newer to the astrology community, who were just discovering astrology during the pandemic, who had some time, who were rethinking their lives, all these different things. And we had established astrologers who weren't as adroit or adept on social media and didn't know all the different things to consider, who were thought to be irrelevant or put out. And so we had confusion. So we did find some other things that were positive, inspiration for those newer to the community to foster innovative ways to foster community. And this, I'm gonna get a little deeper into this because we saw more people creating ways to come together as a community. You might have noticed that there's a group here, Ascendant Assemblies. Where are y'all? Take note, right? That also created ways in which to foster community. What it is, as I understand it, are ways in which you can assemble people by their rising signs to have active conversations about their experiences. Some of that we saw at NORWAC because some rooms were organized in 2020 or 2021, according to rising signs, and it's just proliferated from there. So that's just one example that we saw in terms of people taking back some measure of power or creating some measure of power to have a sense of community. There was a lack of transference of knowledge and experience between old and new astrologers. So that's something that we also started to lose. There was pain and anger and fear with less love shown and circulated. And I think I'll come back to that to talk about how important love is. And then I want to share something from a friend of mine that I once, you guys got a sense that I like to party. So I was at a party and this, it's true. Moon and Leo, what can I say? So I was at a party and randomly my friend Laura Marie Thompson, who I'm quoting here, she said something that really just, actually at the time I was drinking, so I was like, oh, this is destroying my buzz, but she said, people want to be right more than they want to be loved. And I think that's really important to kind of take in. Do you want to be right more than you want to be loved? And I had to really think, I want to be loved, right? In terms of experiencing that, rather than focusing so much on being right, because that's something that can overtake us in our community. So let me give some advice when they come for you. Now, who's they? Okay. And I want to say, I've been they, and I've been on the other side of that, right? I have taken some people down or tried to take some people down through social media, whether they deserved it or not. So I'm not going to be a hypocrite and say like, well, they're over there, right? But that's not what I'm really saying. That is actually a movable thing, a movable feast, as we could say. So let me just say some advice that I hope proves helpful. So one, be slow to react and become defensive, because that will not work in your favor. Seek to clear your understanding of your offense, even if you at first don't see the offense. I didn't say anything wrong. You don't know what you said. So it's to take account first of what you may have said that may have offended someone. Get a perspective from a friend or friends you trust about what you said. And let me say this, and let me be clear, because I know you see it in big block letters there. Do not block people. Now, let me say why you want to be careful with that. When I say do not block people, I'm not talking about any particular time. If you have a troll, okay, block your troll, right? Or mute them. That's not what I'm saying. I'm talking about when you have a throng of people coming for you because you made some particular offense. One of the worst things that you can do is then to start blocking them. Why? Because then it means that you've just shut down and you're not open for conversation, especially if you are an established astrologer. You have to recognize, and sometimes I have trouble recognizing that for myself, you're part of the establishment. And it's not just a matter of being, for instance, older or younger. It's that when you are part of the establishment, you are not just representing yourself. So blocking people means that you're not open to some measured discourse. And if you need to, take some time away from social media. Go play with some puppies or kittens, right? Or throw a frisbee or whatever. After you've thought about things, weigh out if you owe someone an apology. And this is very important. Please look up how to offer an apology. To say, I'm sorry you feel that way, is not an apology. It isn't. So it becomes important to talk about where you made the offense and to process that. I also would recommend that when you've offended someone, try to establish some measure of a conversation with that person. Just like we think about with Mercury retrograde, where we say like, okay, let me stop texting and maybe call that person, find some way to talk. Because that actually can clarify things rather than just going back and forth with a lot of messages. One other thing I would advise and recommend, and by the way, can you tell that I have a degree in public relations? I do. I mean, you don't know that because I don't talk about it and we don't talk about our past, but that way. But I do have a degree in public relations. And one of the things I would tell you is that you do have to be careful. There was a particular astrologer who will remain nameless, who actually started having a conversation privately with someone and then had their DMs published. Okay. Now, I actually put on my S again, and I actually challenged the person, who's like, why would you do that? And I ended up having a very instructive conversation with that person who wasn't even in the United States. Now, neither person, the astrologer nor the person who published that person's DMs, was actually in the United States. And I actually had a Zoom call with the person who was in another country, and they thought publishing the DMs was a way of demonstrating or giving receipts, as they put it, a way of saying like, see, this is what they said. And I was like, well, that actually is a betrayal of trust for someone else. So I think it's best to talk about misperceptions we have by generation so that we get on the same page. And the easiest way to do that is to talk to the person. Also, there's no point in issuing a public apology if you also haven't said it to the person, because that just looks like you're just virtue signaling, right? So it's really, if you've done harm to the person, your first obligation is to that person, right? Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Yeah, good, okay. So we're on the work of going from calling out to calling in. And I think this is an important point to make, because you see here, we have a very diverse crowd, and it's been mostly nothing but love this weekend, right? In terms of socializing, getting to know people from different walks of life, different parts of the world. And I think that idea of calling in rather than calling out, thinking about ourselves as a community, is an important thing to think about as we've now come back together, especially in person. Because it's easy when you're on the World Wide Web to hide behind some measure of anonymity and behind your avatar or whatever. Even if you use your name, you don't get to see the same reaction as you talk to the person. So here are some things that is a useful taxonomy from Natalie Wynn, who talks about ways in which there can be some of the toxic elements of call-out culture. I won't read all of them because you can read, and just also in the interest of time, but I can explain some of them. You know, sometimes we can hide behind some of these things: unforgivability, essentialism, presumption of guilt, rather than recognizing, okay, maybe this person is ignorant. Now, there are some questions we need to consider, but I'll come to that in a few more slides. So what's interesting is Dr. or Professor Loretta Ross at Smith College has talked about ways of calling people out rather than being focused on calling them in, rather than calling them out. Now, in her class, I'm not saying this is true for all spaces, there are no trigger or safe spaces in her class. But I think one thing to think about is when you want to call someone in rather than calling someone out, do you want to shame them? Is shaming the way by which we have the effect that we want with people? I mean, people that you want to know or you could come to know. Again, when we don't know each other in a community, we can just say like, well, so-and-so, I'm calling them out because of this, this, and that. Rather than thinking about, well, this person is within the astrology community, someone I might meet at a conference. How might I set up a different kind of conversation rather than just shaming them? Calling in is like calling out, but done privately and with respect. It's a call out done with love. And I think that's important. Love, respect. And it's not even just because I'm saying like, well, just love the other person, honey. I'm more so saying, love yourself and love the community in which you're participating. And if you love that community, then you can find your way to support that person. I'm not saying you have to love that person. You may not know that person, but you can love that sense of community. And focus on direct contact with private messaging or using the phone or FaceTime. So key points for calling in, look for deeper meaning together and to find a mutual sense of understanding across difference rather than focusing on difference. When we are seeking to understand or learn more. And again, this goes both ways for someone who's offended and someone who's offending. When we want to imagine different perspectives, possibilities, or outcomes, provide for multiple perspectives, encouraging paradigm shifts, focus on reflection, not reaction. That's important, we say it again. Focus on reflection, not reaction, because it's so easy just to press that send button after you oh, okay, there's a meme related to that. Ooh, child, and we just let those fingers start to fly. So, oops, see, I got all excited. Let me find my way back to it. All right, I'll do it quickly. But yes, and I've been there. I know I can be quick, but I've come to limit how quick I've become. Just for those who know me on Twitter, if they're a stranger, I'm like, well, I feel like flame flesh today. I'll do it. But if it's someone in our community or some name I recognize, I think twice. In fact, giving props to someone, I'll just remain nameless. When someone saw that I said something that was questionable or out of my lane, as they put it, They DM'd me. They talked with me. Rather than going just on the timeline like, Sam, you don't know what the hell you're talking about right here. And that actually could have been more divisive and derisive and sour energy between us, but that's not what happened. Calling in is just a suggestion with an uptick. It's not, thank you, because I was looking at that like that doesn't make sense. Calling in is not a suggestion with just an uptick. So it's not just a matter of saying, don't you think you should? Because again, that's leveling judgment rather than trying to create space. But there are some questions to ask related to this. So I'm not going to say, this is the way you should do it. I don't know. But there are some ways I'm thinking about it. How does calling in not become exhaustive emotional labor for people involved, especially initiating the calls? So for instance, if someone says something that is insensitive to a group of people, whether that's about race, gender, or whatever, it can become exhausting emotional labor to kind of try to correct people. I know there are a number of people, I'm just going to talk about it from the racial end since I know that dynamic. It can be exhausting to kind of correct white people up. Some people know what I'm talking about, right? It can become an issue, right? So I'm not saying that your work is when you see a white person going astray, save them. No. That's not what we're here for. And I'm just not making this about race, right? This can be a lot of different things. We have a lot of different kinds of people, and I'll talk more about that. But I think that becomes an important thing for us to address, rather than just relying on, well, we'll wing it. And we can just keep doing that as if we have unlimited energy. We do not. Ross makes a distinction between punching down, calling out people who have less power than you, and punching up. So calling out people who have more power and influence, like bosses, corporations, abusers, and the like. But there's also an issue. Where do we draw the line? So do we just call out, for instance, conference organizers because they seem to have more power than us, as an example? So those are some things to consider. Hard to figure out the right proportion of outrage to shaming per the original transgression. There's no easy formula. There's no easy maxim that I can give you that lays out how you figure that out. But I think it's important to contemplate the question. So I think it's also important for us to create safe spaces for listening. I don't know if we listen to each other enough. One of my hopes for the panel that we organized earlier is for us to talk. We didn't have enough time to have the conversation, but that's also what the after parties are for, right? So we can start these conversations and listen to each other and share. And that's what I mean by creating more spaces by which we can have that. And I'm going to talk about that a little more in terms of organizations particularly, but that's something for us to talk about, creating more spaces rather than just outrages. But there are limits to this, okay? When we're talking about diversity, I will say, and this is a quote from Robert Jones, who's also known as the son of Baldwin, we can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist. So, yeah. You don't get to debate with a trans person about trans life. Or a gay person, or wanting to define like, well, are you really black though? I mean, you're not black. You don't get to have that kind of conversation with someone, especially as a defining point of who they are or who they are not. So I think that's what we have to recognize. There is a limit to tolerance. And a lot of people will say well, you're not completely tolerant. I'm not going to be tolerant of your BS or your annihilation of who I am or who I declare myself to be. Those things are important. So now we reach a point where we have to think about how we recenter our astrological community, because there's been some decentering. One, we have to break up a myth. There's never been one astrological community. there's been multiple astrological communities, but when we talk about astrological community, right, we're recognizing that we're talking about the conception of a whole that we may not even fully grasp. It's like God. But the international and intercultural clusters of folks who love, study, and practice astrology can and do find pathways of connection through organizations, through events like this. All these are ways in which we can have different clusters that come together as various communities. And an open door and policy of non-discrimination is not enough. So I'm going to come back to this, but I will say this now. When I first got active in the astrological community, and that was roughly around 2008. Now I had been studying astrology, but I wasn't active in the community. What I can tell you, to give you a contrast for some of you who are coming to your first astrological conference and you see all this diversity and range, and I was just talking about this with my brother Vernon Robinson in the back, is recognizing we were like raisins in the sun. Literally, I could count the number of people of brown persuasion, perhaps on a few fingers, definitely one hand. And that was my initial experience. Now, beyond that, when I got on a board of directors for an organization, I actually would have to have conversations like, well, when no one is really stopping the whatever from coming in. You know, we don't have signs up there blocking people from coming in. But what you're seeing as the difference with NORWAC and how it's become a leader among conferences, I'll come back to that, is that this was the entity that actually sent out an invite. It's not just a matter of barring people, because that was true. No organization was barring anyone from coming, but they also weren't inviting anybody. So that's an important distinction. We must also be attentive and creative about how we care and protect each other, and attentive to restorative justice rather than punitive. Most astrology orgs have no power to punish as much as to mediate. A lot of people think like, well, I'm gonna go to ESAR and tell them this, or OPA, I'm gonna go to NCGR. They're not gonna rush to put people out for you or anybody else. There's only a process of mediation and discussion. Now, some of that is changing because we have an organization that's in the works, that's actually up and ready. The International Association for Ethics in Astrology, IAEA. So you can, yeah, give them some love. So there's going to be more of an organic way to deal with some justice that's more among us rather than just looking to organizations to mediate, or not mediate, but just decide whether to have someone's membership revoked or whatever. It's going to be a more self-governing body that we need in terms of astrology. So what I want to share with you is that I did find the date for the first set of emails we sent out announcing the diversity scholarship. The time is debatable. I'm just using 9 a.m. as perhaps the time that I sent out the first email announcing diversity scholarships. But it was March 4th, 2015. And I will say that I think I put Seattle, Washington, because I put it for Laura's location. Now, what I want to point out is you see the Venus-Uranus in the 12th house conjunction. I think that's very powerful. And then, you know, there's a number of things about this chart, but what I really want to point out is that we're approaching, this is going to be true in 2023, our first Saturn square. And I want to take a quote from Cycles of Becoming by Alexander Ruperti, where he says, the will may be expressed, and this is talking about the Saturn square, and the first Saturn square happens around 7 years old in an individual. So your teeth are coming in, and all, you know, you're doing a lot more socialization. So here's one definition he gives. And by the way, Cycles of Becoming is a great book to get, okay, by Alexander Ruperti. The will may be expressed either through activities directed against some potential or actual adversary, or it may manifest creatively through activities which mold inert materials into an image of one's own choice. So there's a creative option, and then there's also a way in which we're dealing with some measure of adversity, or some way in which we kind of have to step forward and be bold with particular structures that, again, are creative in the sense of your own way of kicking up against the pricks, you know, the check, I don't mean that literally, but more against where, that's the former preacher in me, because that was actually a quote from the Bible in terms of why do you struggle against things that are either fated. But I'm talking more about struggling against adversity, you know, and this is going to be, we have growth spurts that we're going to be dealing with during this year for this diversity scholarship. We have, but that's one thing I'm saying about this particular group. Some particular challenges that we face in terms of how we now reaching this level, this maximum number, or not even maximum number, you know, are we going to stay at this hotel, for instance, in terms of growth, all these particular things, because now when we're talking about diversity, is 10 enough in terms of the number of scholarship winners? So these particular ways in which we're thinking about how things change in our community really become important for us to start considering, because this goes to the next thing I want to talk about. What have I learned and can share in 7 years of doing this kind of diversity, this opening Saturn Square? One, and you're seeing it around you, nothing is sweeter than success and a greater catalyst. One thing I know is that the diversity scholarship became a catalyst for other organizations and institutions to implement their own diversity scholarship programs. And this includes even organizations and, you know, certain people is like, well, we're not blocking them from coming. It's really kind of going to the next step. The other thing I want to say, now I'm giving a tip for those who want to apply for the diversity scholarship next year. Now I'm also talking to organizations and people who want to create their own diversity scholarship as well, but it goes both ways. Think about your goodwill, whether financial or otherwise, as an investment, not a handout. Now, let me break this down both ways. Now, that's pretty clear for those who have organizations or who want to kind of do more diversity scholarship. But for those who are applying, I'm going to be honest with you about something. Some of you have applied and said, like, well, I found astrology when I was 5 years old, and I just love astrology, and I really want to come to your conference. I don't care. That may sound cold, and okay, I have my Mars in Capricorn. I don't care about your judgment either, but I'm going to tell you why that's important. Because, and I think we can find a space for that. So that's the very next point. So I'm not being that cold. I do have a Pisces rising. But I want to say this. It's not about you as much as what are you doing and prepared to do in the community that you want to be a part of. That really is it. We want to see how active have you been. So saying like, I just love astrology. Okay, so there's 50 other people who are applying. But what stands out, what we have picked with the people who have gotten scholarships before, and people like Colin Bettle, like Ace, or Alice Yang, right? Like Mecca Woods, like Janelle Belgrave, are people who are active in, or, I'm sorry, Cameron Allen. Who are doing the work and then will do more of the work. So I'm just being very honest with you so people know how to apply. And this is not just for NORWAC, but for other organizations, because they're also picking up on that. Because it can become a deficit for our community that you come once to a conference and we never see you again. Never hear about you because you love astrology and you discovered when you're 5, you know, that doesn't mean as much for us. So the other thing is, though, we can't be negligent of those who don't know what to do or where to begin. So one of the things that I want to say is that Yes, there are those who are already doing the work, but we do need to help those who are just getting started. Now, that may not be what NORWAC and the diversity scholarship is about, but someone else who's listening, that could be what you're about in terms of cultivating and supporting those who are just starting out, who did discover astrology when they were 5 and love it. How do we support them and get them more motivated and active in finding ways that they can belong? And that's a key word, to belong. So that's one other thing I want to say. And think the long game, not just quick and easy wins, just in terms of getting scholarships or receiving them. How are you going to plan? And this is something that I was really grateful in terms of the Organization for Professional Astrologers, OPA, in terms of their mentoring program. It's really to cultivate people to participate in the long game of establishing their practice in astrology. So I think that's a very powerful thing that we need to consider. But I have some cautions for you. This is probably where I'm going to get in trouble, so I'm going to get some water. So let's talk about respectability. One of the things I love about millennials is they have burst the bubble on the bullshit behind respectability politics. I love it. And why I love it is because I am Generation X, kind of that silent generation that often gets forgotten. Because everyone goes like, why are you a boomer? No, I'm not a boomer. Right? But it's this idea. Now I'm putting it in a particular context because I know I'm here to talk about astrology, but I'm putting it in a context first to talk about in terms of racial dynamics. So, and I have 2 degrees in African American studies, and I have studied a good portion of our history. And there has been this longstanding belief that when we're respectable and like we have right names, not like Jaquanda or whatever, they're going to like us, right? And they're going to respect us, talking about white folk and whatever. But we had a president named Barack Hussein Obama, and they didn't give a shit about him as a Black president. And when I say they, I mean, many of you might have liked him, voted for him, but in terms of what happened to his family, the level of vitriol they experienced on a daily basis, it didn't become about really respecting him. So you're like, where are you going with this, Sam? We're not talking about Barack. Well, I am going to challenge this idea that we are looking for respect from the general world and population for astrology. Because I'm going to tell you something that I've learned from studying racial dynamics. And it may not be applicable, but I'm going to say it anyway, which is that we can't do the love of astrology, have respect for astrology for the outside world. We have to have respect for that for ourselves. Because when someone has become determined to hate you, you cannot necessarily reason with them. So when we talk about, yes, I believe in professionalism. I believe in quality education in astrology, but I am not training people so that the world respects us and just treats us right, because nothing has shown me that more than what happened to Barack Hussein Obama. Now, that was always true. I'm not just putting this on Obama. People are going to respect you because mostly you respect yourself. Now, this is my opinion. I know some of you will differ with me, but that's kind of one thing. Now, this doesn't call for pessimism, though. I'm not saying like it's not worth it to do respect, to have respect for ourselves, to have professionalism, to have quality training, to have consulting skills training, to have all these particular things, to have ethics in astrology. These things are worth it, but we have to stay focused on us because we care about ourselves. Like, I didn't dress like this because I just wanted to impress you. I wanted to feel good, right? And so that's what we have to kind of embrace. Not just kind of trying to prove ourselves to the outside world, because I don't know if that always works. Also, as I prepare to step away from an organization for which I've been a part for 9 years, Astrology organizations, you're on notice. One of the things that I've learned in 9 years of being on an organizational board is that astro lovers are no longer exclusively beholden to organizations for structure, professionalism, or access to astrological content. What many of you may not know, who've actually learned more astrology from YouTube, on the web, is that it was conferences like this that people lived for in order to have access to books and teachers. This was true for decades. It is no longer true. So that's something to consider. The other thing is that when I first got on the board, I presented a question that I think is still true. That I think some of you even ask, what do I need you for? What do I need ESAR for? What do I need NCGR or OPA for? Now, the orgs are working on answering that question, but I still think it is a valid question. And what I will say is that we have a growing number of independent conferences popping up. This is one. I mean, it's been around for 38, 39 years, but it's growing. David Cochran in the back has his own independent conference that he's developing for vibrational astrology. And so we're going to see, there's also another conference that's happening in Lilydale. Oh, someone's clapping for that. In Lilydale, that's also another regional independent conference that also we might see a good number of attendance. So with a growing crop of now there's always been regional conferences. That's not completely new. But let me tell you something. This, what you're seeing, this is a whole new, what you've seen with NORWAC for the last 3 years, that's a whole new ballgame. Regional conferences, as it was even up until, let's say, 2018, 2019, well, I would say 2018, were mostly 150 to 300 people, right? So this is at 500 people. That was the expectation. It was really intimate, very small. You know, you left it to UAC, which is the United Astrology Conference, to have, like, where you have this kind of number, 500 to 1,000 people or more. So we're going into new territory that's very different than the organizations have known. The other thing I want to talk about is that we have to widen our points of reference. Let me tell you this. So for UAC 2018, and Laura right there is my witness, there were certain organizations that did not want tarot readers to participate in the marketplace at UAC. Am I lying? I'm not lying. We have to get beyond that. If organizations are going to survive, we have to become friendly and open to all the mantic arts, all forms of divination. We have to also learn to respect, understand, and seek to understand indigenous traditions. So we have to be willing to reach out. We have to foster better relationships between schools and organizations. And so for those who are also here, I'm talking also to myself because I'm on the board for ESAR. What's happening with UAC? What y'all doing? It's real quiet. We were supposed to, I mean, I know we've had a pandemic, so that has slowed things down. But it is now 2022. Things to know. If you are going to have a UAC, that is something that starts planning at least 3 years out. Right? 3 or 4? 3. 3 years out. So if we're talking about having one in 2025, what y'all doing? We got a hotel? And I think we have to realize, and this is where orgs, because I recognize this, orgs kind of like, well, we'll get to it. Do you serve our community or not? Or are we serving you? I know, I mean, I have a lot of strong Mars, as I said, so sometimes it can sound a little hostile. So, I'll bring that to our board meeting. But it is recognizing that you don't have to stay patient. You can start asking more of your organizations. You can start writing them and let them know what's happening, because we are a community. We also have to think about how we have more organizational reach. To my knowledge, there's not an organization that has satellites or connections in another country other than South Africa, in Africa. Only South Africa. But there's a growing number of people in Kenya, in Nigeria, and we have to be willing to kind of reach out. How can we foster those connections? And I'd be like, well, are you just talking about Africa? Well, we got a lot in Europe. We have a good number in South America. We have a good number of groups in Australia and Canada. The only continent where we don't have a strong presence of astrology on a global scale is Africa, our home. I'd also say this, in case people forget, Egypt is in Africa. But I'm not going to put the burden just on organizations. So astrologers, astro fans, and yes, I know it's rude, astro idiots. Like, well, you're trying to foster community, Sam, so why are you using astro idiots? Okay, yeah, but because we have moments where, you know, it brings up a question, and I am framing this as a question, even though I made that statement partly for fun. You know, and some of you, like I said, who follow me on Twitter, like we have strange things that happen. I'm gonna say, quoting like one of my favorite series, if any of you have ever seen the first season of True Detective, you know, one of the detectives said, like, just stop saying odd shit, right? It's not professional. I don't know if some of you may not get it, but that's sometimes what I see. So one example of this is like, if you've actually survived this past Mercury retrograde, you can survive anything. That's a quote. Or someone said, like, none of the fixed signs have been the same since 2019. Another quote. So I think we have to deal with, how do we maintain quality in our field without policing people's takes, whether they're hot or not? How do we convince people that the web may not be enough, considering there are whole forms of astrology from today to Hellenistic times that's more found among individual practitioners and rarer among books than the web or YouTube videos. Like I showed to my class recently the dial, using the Uranian dial. They're like, what's that? You're not talking about that on the web or on Twitter. So we have to be willing to kind of talk about things that are not necessarily easily found on the web. How do we encourage real research, qualitative or quantitative? How do we convince more newcomers and self-learners to realize that much can be missed in their astro education? Sometimes you don't know what you don't know. How can we create more dialogue about our art and practice without getting into a fight? And you know, sometimes it seems like we also start fights. Somebody comes on and like, oh, are you still using the tropical zodiac? How do we avoid the age-old Chronos versus Uranus fight? What I mean by that, avoid undermining old and experienced astrologers and then doing the same to young and inexperienced astrologers alike. So I think we have to kind of find a way for that too. And I must say, we must prepare for the ones yet to come. Our work is not done. We are not all here. And what I mean by that, so one example is Vanessa Guy, who's a winner of the Organizational for Professional Astrologers 2022 Most Promising Astrologer Award, getting an award of $5,000 because they are a hearing impaired person who is looking to bring more hearing impaired people into our community. Laura talked about that during our panel. Yeah. And we're starting, what you're seeing, in case you've been wondering, like, what's all this for? What are you showing that for? So that more people who are hearing impaired, as Zoom in their closed captioning improves, can see, even though they cannot hear, and also that we can also do dual streaming. This is not for this year, but we're preparing and laying the groundwork for to be able to do that. So that's something that we should also see from more organizations. But again, you're seeing like the cutting edge here. The other thing is that we have to make more space for those in wheelchairs and who are neurodivergent. And then I'm going to reveal something. And is Peter Malotza here? Did he come? Yeah, I'm here. Okay, there you are. So Peter, I was at a party, I was at Clifford's party last night, and Peter shared the story of his friend, Jay Jix, who also, who's no longer with us because he had severe allergies and died from an allergic reaction. And I was at the, he was saying how Jix showed him and talked to him about the appreciation for, a short life, a life lived. And what I want to share with you, and that's, I was actually, I don't know if you noticed it, Peter, I was actually near tears with it. Not because it's just a touching story. I am passing. No, I'm Black. But I'm passing, meaning in terms of my other side of people, the kind of people, we're not fully here. Meaning I have spina bifida and I have had 25 surgeries in my lifetime just to be alive. My doctors, my doctors when I was young gave my mother a 50-50 chance that I would survive. And most people with my disability, we don't live long. And I'm not saying that because I want you to pity me, because I don't want your pity. But it is to remind you that life is precious. And also to remind you that I'm passing, but there are people who I know who are in wheelchairs where I spent the first 5 years of my life in a wheelchair who are not here. There are people in crutches with canes. We have someone here who is visually impaired, but we don't have enough. We don't have the people, my people, the people I grew up with, the people who are told that, you can't do this or blah, 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 who are here. Now, I didn't listen to them. That's why I've been passing. But I'm also respecting those who are not here. So we have to think about how we include those who are not here who should be here. What I'm saying to you ultimately is, how dare we be people who reach for stars but don't reach for each other? So it becomes essential that we find ways in which we can bring more people into this experience. More people who, for whatever, we've been talking about neurodivergency, we've talked about those who are along the spectrum of gender and sexuality, but are we inclusive of even people I haven't even named that who belong here, who can be here? Now we have someone like Vanessa Guy who's coming into our community who can do more, but I think this is where love comes in. And I want to quote something from an astrologer, Moses Sirigard III, who put this on Facebook, and I'm going to read part of it. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I think it was a very good reminder about the power of astrology related to something essential, love. Because we can talk about all the things from the mind and all the things in terms of different aspects of harmonics and aspects and orbs, but we're really talking about love. And he says, astrology is like love. A lot of people don't believe in it, but it's not going anywhere because it's so much part of the fabric of who we are than we realize. So we can't stop looking to the night sky, and the sky gods keep reflecting us back to ourselves in the cosmic mirror, because I suspect the universe loves us so much that it would somehow magically arrange the heavens to act as a roadmap for each individual, born at a time and a place with so many obvious signs that it's all obviously something and not nothing, in order to show us that there are higher truths and principles worth aspiring toward. So I want to leave you with one particular thought, and we'll excuse for now this gender preference here that's listed. And the world will be a better place, oh, that one man or all of us, scorned and covered with scars, still strong with his last or their last ounce of courage to reach the unreachable, the unreachable, the unreachable star. With that said, thank you. Have a beautiful night.